Welcome to Data. It's not just for nerds anymore. This is day 2 of the ISP Virtual Summit, and we've got Kristian Hoffman with us here. Kristian, I'll introduce myself a little bit, and then I'd love for you to give a quick intro about yourself and Cal.net and your roles there. I'm Jeremy Austin. I'm the Senior Product Manager at Preseem. I've been with Preseem since late 2020. And prior to that, I've been building networks in the wireline and wireless space since the 90s. So long list. But yeah, Kristian, go ahead and introduce yourself.
Yeah, I started in the ISP industry in '97 at a dial-up ISP and became a WISP in about 2000. And yeah, I've done pretty much every job between janitor and president and owner. And so it gives me, I feel, a unique perspective on how everything's made. And currently at CalNet, I'm chief architect, and so looking for ways to automate, kind of bring the whole design together. And yeah.
That's cool. You know, as I haven't been in the WISP space, I think, quite as long as you, but one of the things that I discovered I really enjoyed was, using data, using numbers to really understand what might be sort of chaotic real world processes, and also using numbers to like reconcile business needs with engineering concerns. And both of them both of them speak the language of numbers, but sometimes they kind of talk past one another because they don't agree on what they're talking about. So I think you're going to give us some really great tips on that today. And so let's dive right into your presentation, Kristian. I'm probably going to ask questions as we go along. We'll have a little bit of a live demo, and then we'll be taking live Q&A after the presentation as well. Go ahead.
Okay. Having a slide malfunction. There we go. So yeah, exactly that. I wanted to talk today about, as the title would suggest, data is not just for nerds anymore. I love data. I love analyzing data and trying to figure out how to make use of it. But often I find, for me, that's how can I mash a query together to bring that information together, and that's not everybody knows SQL. Not everybody can has those tools, but they should be accessible to everybody. So in general, I thought it'd be good to talk about how to bring, from the technical standpoint, knowledge to the technical people of what a decision maker, someone that's doing business analysis, what they need to know to make good business decisions, and also from the business standpoint, how do you ask your technical people for the right things, or you don't have enough of the right technical people, how do you use tools that are available, or what tools are available to get that data in a digestible way. So starting with that, this is Preseem, or we're talking about a tool that's for the WISP industry. What is a WISP? So WISP, to me, it's always been that entrepreneurial, you see a need in the neighborhood, it's my neighbor, my friend, or the people in my community don't have internet access, and I've got enough technical know-how, I've got the bits, I've got some cash, maybe an empty credit card, and I'm going to take that and I'm going to make something happen. And
So let's go build it first and run the numbers later.
Yeah, yes, the entrepreneur at heart. So definitely. And I think in a lot of ways, WISPs have been able to make good inroads in the markets that they've been versus the big names out there, the telcos, the typical duopoly and monopolies out there, because they're agile. They're small. They can move quickly. They know the community. They can react quickly to market forces, market changes, and that sort of thing. And of course, then obviously willing to take risks. The scale is smaller. The risks are smaller. It doesn't always feel small. It's your life, it's your money, it's your time. But you can make decisions that you're not talking about states worth of the decisions. I'm rolling this out to 300,000 customers. It better be the right decision. It's 300 customers, something like that. So, so on the other side of things, business analytics. I pulled the definition from Wikipedia. Just talking about the skills and technologies, practices for exploring patterns, business performance, gaining insights so you can make good decisions in the future. And of course, in order to do all that, you have to have data. You've got to have um, the bits and pieces to make those decisions. So bringing those two together, how do we, what tools do we have to replace that intuition now that entrepreneur was using? That I know the community, I know the people, and I've always been able to do those things. How do we make start making data driven decisions versus using your intuition? Because obviously
I
with
have a question about that,
uh,
Kristian. Do
yeah.
you see it like a pure, like, as, I mean, this is kind of a leading question, but like as a pure replacement, or do you see it like as an augmentation to intuition?
I think if you go to the furthest extreme of a data-driven business, it's too sterile. The theory of mine is that there's not one big wisp out there because there isn't a cookie cut. There's no pattern. There's no mold that you can take that is the perfect wisp model and just stamp it across the country. In my own experience, my own business was focused in a like Central Valley or the California Central Valley area. It's flat agriculture, but that has its own challenges. Versus now, as a bigger part of CalNet, CalNet has a lot of mountainous terrain, foothills, pine trees, oaks, all that stuff. And it's neither of those are easy, and they're hard for different reasons, and the solutions aren't the same. And what is actually a great solution in one area is a terrible thing to do in another. So it's uh, that being able to read the land and the people, I think, is is still a huge part of it. So definitely, you can't sterilize the process and run entirely by the numbers. The boots on the ground entrepreneur is still an important ingredient to that recipe.
One of the things I do when I'm working on products over here at Preseem that are very heavily numbers driven is I will challenge my intuitions. You say, I think this should look like X, and do I get that out of the process? And if I don't, what is that telling me? Like that can often be I find a really helpful sanity check. And not that it's going to invalidate my intuition. Sometimes that happens, but that's rare. It's more a case of it's going to actually quantify the things that I already expect. Or sometimes you say, we might have we think that this particular thing is contributing X to the total, and when you really run the numbers out, you might find, well, that's a smaller deal than you think, or conversely, it might be like a bigger deal than you think. So it's really helpful to have the numbers to back that up.
That's a good point. Yeah. I I'll admit I found myself in a place where I'm like, I'm sure that this is true. Like I've seen it enough times. I can say this confidently. And someone questions it, and I say, oh, okay, fine. I'll go get the numbers and I'll make sure that I'm right, because you have to be able to question yourself. And it's the same thing. You hope that you're right most of the time, but you have to be willing to look at the numbers and say, okay, the numbers don't back it up. And there's still times I think where uh, maybe your intuition, you still want to go with that. But at least if you've done the analysis, it's it's worth it.
So
Um,
how is analysis going to be needed here as we, as WISPs are, um, pursuing more government grants and other activities and other funding sources? What are the things that they're needing to measure?
one of one of the biggest, and this kind of bifurcates into the people that are involved in the subsidy and grant programs and the people that aren't. A lot of the needs are the same, and I'll just go with the assumption that whether or not you are participating in the process from receiving monies from these programs, you should still be participating in the process as an awareness of your market, and then that's where it comes into place. In the U.S., we've got the FCC's Fabric that's been rolled out, replacing the Form 477 for broadband deployment reporting, um, and identifying down to the location level, down to the structure level, where broadband service is and isn't. And so where, I mean, back 20 years ago, that community over there, we've got it pretty much covered, and you could draw a circle. Those days, are pretty much over. We need location level data to understand either from the subsidy and grant program standpoint, what is eligible for these programs? Do I cover them? Do I not cover them? Do I have customers there? Do I want to apply for these programs, or do I want to place myself to be in a good competitive position so that if somebody does receive these funding or does receive funding, that I'm in a good place, and not just that you wake up one day and there's someone and they're building out, which is the common complaint within the WISP industry, which understood that's a valid concern. But yes, the knowledge of what's coming, the information is there. It unfortunately takes time and effort to analyze, but definitely worth the trouble. So also from just a business analytics standpoint, obviously the Preseem is a topic here, and so what are the variables? What are we looking for in business analytics? Let's go on to the next slide. As far as what are the metrics that we're interested in, and I would say that to all WISP, you can categorize those, and there's lots of things, many ways you can slice and dice this, but for our purposes, there's two things that are precious to all WISPs. You have customers. Without customers, you're a charity. You're providing free internet to a community, which maybe that's the thing. But for the people that are for-profit businesses, customers are an important aspect. On the other hand, the other side of things, you've got Spectrum, and without Spectrum, there's no wireless, right? And there's all flavors there as far as unlicensed and licensed. I would say it all. From a physics standpoint, physics doesn't care about licenses or not. So there's that aspect of it, but also unlicensed has its own risks and ease of use versus licensed. So there's regulatory encumbrances there that you have to deal with. So on the customer side of those metrics, we've got things that are not particularly unique to the WISP industry. You have average revenue per user, you've got net promoter scores, how well do people like you, social scores. I'm not a marketing guy, so I'm making up stuff here. But it's those are the common things I would say to most, if not all, service industries. Your face to the customer, how their perception of you, how well your service is received, and those sorts of things. On the technical side of things, on the Spectrum side, we have how well are you using that resource? Because it's a resource. To me, it should be as right next to cash on the balance sheet. It's something that I have, and I can either use it well or I can not use it well. But how do we quantify those things or qualify them? Again, going way back in the day, I remember early days of installations. An installer would go out, put up a radio, and say, "I can ping. I can ping Google. We're good." That was the metric. That was the litmus test. Did we do a good thing? I can ping Google. Yes, check the box. Now, is that a good enough qualifier? Probably not. What's the next easiest? I have a high RSSI, right? The receive strength is high. But is there a direct correlation between high RSSI and high quality or good use of Spectrum? Same thing. If I can connect and I can get good speed, so how do I define good speed? So my maximum package is 25 megabits. I connect a customer, I can do a speed test and achieve those speeds. I've done the thing. I've gotten this customer 25 megs. Okay, what is the cost? What did it take you to get that customer 25 megs? If you're running some equipment that's using 160 megahertz channels, and that is the maximum that you can achieve at that customer's location, that may be the rate that they're paying for, and they may be happy, but your bottom line isn't happy. That's, I would say, not an efficient use of Spectrum. So that said, those things are hard to get at with the equipment that I would say most WISPs are used to dealing with. It has definitely gotten better over the years, but being able to analyze at a large scale and say how are things not just doing now, but progressing over time? Are they trending upwards? Are they trending downwards? There have not been good tools for that. And I would say most vendors, manufacturers themselves, the providers of equipment. Some of them have tools. The metrics that they produce are not the best. I don't want to single anybody out, but that's the lay of the landscape. And with the nature of unlicensed wireless, kind of like we have LTE equipment too, and even then, there's almost the opposite extreme. There's so much information. It's how do you analyze it and determine what is good, what are our requirements. So there's both ends of that spectrum.
That's a really interesting point, and you're right. Efficiency is really important, but there's also the other factor of if you want to measure efficiency in terms of like customers per megahertz, but then there's the dimension of density and in terms of dollars. So like a solution that might make sense in an area where you have very few customers, some of the kind of more entry level gear where you can get a quick ROI on it. It might not be the right locations to deploy a solution that has a higher barrier to entry in terms of cost, but can serve more customers in total. With the newer gear has tended to, as time has gone by, the upper end continues to rise, both in terms of capability and in terms of dollars. So it's interesting that you still have to figure out what the right tool is for every circumstance. It's not just purely um, we think we have this many people here, and we've got this much spectrum here. It's almost like it's a spectrum per it's a customers per megahertz per dollar measurement in a way, which is going to really strongly influence your total ROI, your return on that investment.
Yeah, and that we'll get to that in a second, I believe, as far as market potential, right? And that's knowing that ahead of time. Again, your question earlier on what is some of the data that's available and how do you use it? Looking at geographic data and location data to understand what your market potential is, where the customers could be, whether or not they have service already, whether or not the technology you may be deciding to use gives you a market advantage in that particular case that you can be competitive. If there are competitors, or if there not any competitors, then where does that put you in the marketplace? What offerings should you give? And you can have the best worst thing to happen. You show up on Oprah with an amazing product, and you've been shipping 100 units a month, and now you have your backlog of 100,000 units. You put up an access point. You didn't understand the market. You deployed a piece of equipment that only has so much capacity, and you've got people lined up, out the door ready for service, and you realize I chose poorly. I should have used something that has a lot more capacity. And I think a lot of WISPs had that moment where at some point in their past they say, I would never spend X dollars. Like, to me, that's just too large of a number. I would never spend this much money for an access point or some piece of equipment, or even for backhaul equipment or whatever happens to be, just because it's too much. Like, it's crazy. The customers that I'm used to dealing with, the density that I'm used to dealing with, doesn't pencil out to spend those dollars. But again, that whole like challenging assumptions, challenging intuition. Looking at that and saying, realistically, in this area, I can get X customers, and if I divide dollars by customers, and how much that's going to cost in initial capex outlay, then it actually makes sense to spend that much money. I'm going to get that ROI. So, to that end, using this data to know where your revenue potential is, and what your expenses are. And I just couldn't find if this was a quoted thing, something my business partner used to say a lot, and it's true. So there's two ways to increase profitability, right? You can increase revenue, and you can decrease expenses. And knowing where that market potential is obviously one way to increase revenue. And the correlation I'm making, though, is between I guess unsold capacity with revenue potential is one way to look at it. And again, talking about the data that's available and tools that are available, how do I at scale look at my network, look at access points, and say these things these access points have capacity that is available. And again, things of that entrepreneurial aspect of a lot of WISPs in their beginnings, that bootstrap mode where I see a need, put up an access point, I get customers, they're online, I'm generating revenue. That's great. But there's that point where that it doesn't scale anymore. Either there's not enough hours in the day to sit down and really look at that from an access point by access point basis, or don't have enough hours in a day, enough people on the bench, that sort of thing. There's not enough resources to make that decision on a one by one basis. You need a way to get better data. So of course, once you have that data, being able to analyze that at scale, then of course gives you that ability to find undeveloped markets and ultimately additional revenue. And additional revenue could be in the form of both ARPU increase. So you have customers that are on access points. I think we have a slide later that shows kind of an analysis of that, and maybe have a demo too. But looking at unsold capacity as an opportunity both to add existing customers or add new customers to an existing access point, or to upsell existing customers and increase revenue just with your existing customer base.
So when you're starting out, and I've definitely met many, many WISP operators who are, kind of the one-man shop or maybe a mom and pop shop, and they have a really good handle on what their equipment is doing and what their markets are, and maybe they don't have expansion opportunities. But you're right, there's a point at which does become, it's kind of the opposite end of the when you're first starting out, you have no data to predict from. And so you start deploying even from the question of how is this equipment, this particular vendor's equipment, going to do in this area given these constraints. You don't even necessarily know like what the RF environment is until you start putting equipment up in many cases. And then eventually, as you end up being able to generate your own data and collect your own data, then you then have this kind of processing problem, and you're going to talk a little bit more about that, but. I've definitely seen this happen time and again where, it's easy to keep the intuitions in your head when it's small, but if you want to be able to grow, then you have to really be able to do it systematically. Absolutely.
So on the other end of the balance sheet, and something that I like to harp on a lot is, again, the counter to the example of when I didn't install and I could ping Google, and that's the measure of success. Or I got the speeds that the customer is being provisioned at, which, I mean, this is great. And there's cases where that's okay, right? So I'm in an area, the market potential is very small. And so I can decide to be inefficient with spectrum. But I feel it's an important message that unlicensed spectrum is something that should be used with a high degree of stewardship, right? It needs to be looked after, and it's to the betterment of all, right? If all WISPs practice good spectral efficiency in their builds, that means less interferes from competition and all sorts of things. That's a utopian ideal, wouldn't it be great? But I think the practice, it benefits everybody, and it's not I'm doing something to help the other guy, but I'm helping myself, I'm helping everybody. And so to that end, how it benefits me as a WISP operator, looking at APs with low quality metrics, whatever manufacturer vendor it happens to be, they'll have some kind of way to measure that.
Right.
Or obviously with Preseem can kind of see that at another protocol layer, with TCP latency and that sort of thing, which is definitely an advantage. Whatever the technology has to be, there's some kind of quality metric. And if that quality metric is low, even if the aggregate throughput of all my customers at it that are using it at peak time, let's say I'm still under 100% utilization, or I'm literally at 100% utilization, I'm still using more of that resource than I need to in order to achieve that result. So one, being able to detect that is good, and two, acting on it, I think is in everybody's best interest. Um, how do I improve? How do I take an access point, either and even with configuration changes? Maybe it's a down tilt on an antenna, maybe it's a different type of antenna. Whatever happens, there's all those tools in the WISP and RF tool bag. But how do I, once I've now identified an access point that is underperforming, how do I improve that, and why would I want to do it? Well, again, from the examples previously, increase ARPU, added capacity for additional customers. I think everybody's run into a situation where you've made for whatever decision-making process, this access point is full. And there could be spectrum limitations that I can't add any more access points, or I have space on a tower, whatever happens to be. There's some limitation that is all of the capacity. Not a lot of, say in manufacturing, there's not often a knob you can turn that just increase capacity. Like, poof, my warehouse, 100,000 square foot warehouse is now 200,000 square feet. Like, all of a sudden, I just have more of this resource available. So that's kind of a unique advantage in the WISP industry, that there are ways available to increase the efficiency of that resource that we have, and again, get those benefits. Also, just from the Preseem standpoint of being able to identify APs that are trending. And again, that's not something that's super common in most of the manufacturers. They tell you what the stats are now, but not what they are over time, or especially at scale with multiple access points. And that's, and from a high level integration and architecture standpoint, that's something that I like to focus on. You want customer service to be great. You want your support techs to have great information, all that kind of stuff. But to me, the real target is, how do I even prevent the customer from calling in the first place? How do I even prevent the thought that they say, something I've said before, most customers just sit around and run speed tests, right? They have an experience, and it doesn't meet some expectation in their head, and they're not ISP operators. The tool that they have available is a speed test. And so they run a speed test, and it gives them a number, and they say, this isn't meeting my expectations. If you can rewind that to the point where something happened that didn't meet their expectations before they even ran the speed test, that's the perfect thing. So catching any tool, any metric that you can track and report on, and catch before it reaches that point, customers had the thought even that something wasn't working right. To me, that's gold. Because now it's not how well you handled the support call. You even avoided the support call entirely. Which, you take that, then now you have support guys. Everyone should hope for a support department of guys that have nothing to do. And then they should find them something to do, right? Which could be even analyzing more data, or proactive,
You're right.
finding, using tools and information to find, groom the network, even improve efficiency or AP performance even more, that sort of thing. Things that there aren't tools for. You need that human touch to analyze the data.
Nothing is 100% guaranteed, at any time. But for all my years, in operations and network engineering, I can assure you that fixing something before it became a problem was always cheaper than waiting for it to fail. Well, almost always, 99% of the time, it's cheaper than waiting for it to fail. Or even in some cases, if you know that something's going to fail, making sure that you have you've got the spare, you've got the backup plan where, okay, it might not actually be cheaper to proactively replace it, but you've taken action proactively so that you're going to minimize that downtime. You're going to minimize those chances that the customer is going to have to call you. Having been the customer for many years, whether it was the customer of a tier 2 or a tier 1, I don't want to have to call them, right? I want it to work. So anything that they can do to make it work for me is going to just retain me as a customer.
Yeah. So on the tying the technical to the business, I've maybe been on the more technical side, hopefully relating the two. This is an example of taking a data, and this was someone that took a report from Preseem in this example, of two metrics: subscriber count and access point utilization, and mashed them up in an Excel scatter chart, and said, I'm not an RF guy. I don't know anything about configuring wireless access points, but to me, this is how I would read this. And so I thought this was a fantastic example. And so kind of walking through this, yeah, so we have low performing, low utilized access points on the bottom left, that those have a cost. There's a site there that we have equipment, we're maybe paying for power. Is it even worth it to have these?
Right.
Is there another solution, or can we consolidate them? Because every piece of equipment out there, it means maintenance, upkeep, people in the knot to maintain, all the stuff. There's overhead to that. If they're not at 100%, kind of in the middle field, that, hey, hand this to the marketing department. Did you know that we can be pushing these areas? And then going up to the top right, you've got, we have a lot of subscribers there, and it's overutilized. Do we need to can we add more access
capacity?
Add
Yeah.
more capacity? Can we add, how do we, there's obviously a demand there, and we met it, or we had met it, and now it's exceeded what we can offer. So how do we address that? And then in the bottom right, you've then just got low performers. There's not a lot of customers there, but they're also not working great. So that's not good customer service. We want to catch those before people have called in, if possible. And if they have called in, correlate those and say, hey, we've got a plan, we're working on this, we're going to improve service,
Right.
that sort of thing. So
it's fantastic. It's just a slight modification of like your standard four sector, a Gartner report, right?
Yeah.
Where you look at the 4 quadrants, compare the two things. It's really valuable, and I really like the illustration here where you've whoever built this, they're putting the these are all questions, because it's not a certainty that you need to do this in this area, but it's a really likely very strong correlation in these areas. I really like your point about kind of decommissioning that super underperforming stuff. Maybe if you included like age of the equipment as a third dimension, then you could say, okay, has this equipment paid for itself? Can we afford to get rid of it? I really like that idea. Not that I'm advocating firing any customers, right? But just making sure that your network is making money. In some cases, I've built networks where, unpopulated parts of the network needed to be subsidized by the heavier parts of the network. But that isn't always going to be possible. That's a cool example. Thanks for sharing that with us, Kristian. That's a really, really great way to use data to provide, really, really excellent, this is work for the rest of the team to do, and it's going to give you some projections too, to say, hey, if we have this much capacity here, we can, put that marketing engine to work, put that sales engine to work, and really grow your business. That's fascinating. Yeah, thanks for sharing with us, Kristian. I'm going to give a quick little demo on some data. If you'll hand the reins over to me, Kristian, I will present. I'm just going to give a couple little tips here about some of the things that I find fun when exploring data. In case you think that data is intimidating, or that the numbers themselves make your eyes glaze over, it doesn't have to be that way. So I'm going to start with just a quick table here. The numbers don't really matter in this particular case. You don't need to read them. I'm just looking at the RF score from Preseem Plus here for a bunch of access points. In fact, this is Kristian's network. He's graciously allowed us to show you some sanitized data here. And then I'm comparing, this is another way to compare that, the results of that last chart that you showed us, Kristian, where you're looking at like the overall performance in terms of efficiency of that access point. Because just pure consumption alone, as you showed with that airtime used, if you just looked at that graph, that doesn't tell you anything about like how efficiently it's being used. If you've got a heavily loaded access point that's making a ton of money, that's not I use the term pathological. That's not a problem. It's not a problem if it's got a lot of customers on it and it's busy, right? That's almost ideal. My favorite is where it has a lot of customers and they don't use any data and they just pay you money, but that doesn't happen very often in real life. So I kind of added in, I threw in an additional one. We mentioned this briefly here, but I did this capacity per megahertz. So I'm adding up the number of subscribers on the access point plus the remaining capacity, which is one of our scores in Preseem Plus, which tells you the total capacity of the access point. In some cases, like this one here, where the available subscriber capacity is negative, that means we think it's a little bit overloaded, right? So we're compensating for all of that here. And then let's divide that by megahertz, how wide the channel is, because even on your chart, if you were looking at some 20 megahertz wide channels and some 40 megahertz wide channels, they're going to have different amounts of subscribers on them, and that's normal, right? That's not going to tell you necessarily how efficient it is itself, the access point is itself. So I kind of created this new synthetic metric, which I don't think anybody's ever used before, but we'll just call it capacity per megahertz, and it's basically measured in subscribers per megahertz. So now let's take a look at what that data looks like. One of the easiest ways to look at a single dimension of data is with a histogram. This is essentially, in the vertical axis, it's a count of how many of the underlying samples fall into bins, which you'll see along the horizontal number line, the x-axis here. So in this case, this is a score, so it's kind of like a 0 to 10. What that means is it's going to have a center right around 5. That's in this case, you notice the classic bell curve shape. That's a normal distribution. That means that in kind of this bulk here, are going to be about about 2/3 of the data is going to be in this main part of the bell, and then it's going to taper off to the left, taper off to the right. This is a very, very common shape. The more samples we have out of our population, the closer this will look to like a smooth bell curve. You can't do this with just 10 samples. It's not going to look like a normal distribution, but over about in this case, many hundreds, probably 1,000 in here, we start seeing this shape emerge. And this is only going to happen in cases where we have a process that is more or less organic, right? This is something that has a median, it has a mean, here in the center. But if I told you that number and said, oh yeah, the average RF score on my network is 5.1. Well, that doesn't necessarily tell you very much about the extremes itself. So looking at the entire distribution of that number of that value can be really helpful. Okay, so let's take a look at another one. In this case, the radio's off here to the left. These access points with these really low RF scores, they clearly need to be looked at, right? But there may be some cases where we have RF scores that are in the positive, to the right of the median, to the right of the center, that might still bear some looking into. Let's take a look a little bit further. Now I'll take that synthetic measurement that I did, which is this capacity per megahertz, and we can see that most access points, the center of this, the median here, is right about 1 customer per megahertz, which I think is really, really fun. It's still true. We're averaging about 1 customer per megahertz. Some of the newer gear is averaging higher than that, as we're going up all the way almost to 2 here in some cases. And so this is giving me an idea of how well this spectrum is actually being used, not just in terms of the underlying RF, but how efficiently is it being used. So if we want to look at 2 axes together, though, we would want to determine whether or not there's a correlation between the two. So a positive correlation would mean we'd essentially have a vertical line going up and to the right. A negative correlation would be down and down. So when we plot these 2 axes, just as we saw on Kristian's example, in this case, I put the RF score on the x-axis and this new measurement that I've made, this capacity and subscribers per megahertz on the y-axis, on the vertical axis here. We can now see, exactly where these 2 variables correlate, and there's a pretty strong correlation here, pretty strong positive correlation, which would make sense if you think that as the RF gets better, capacity per subscribers in megahertz is going to improve. So that confirms our intuition here that this is going to make things better. But What I find interesting about this, given the kind of chaotic and noisy world of RF and different hardware models, and when you've been running a WISP any length of time, you end up with multiple generations of equipment, which is all a dimension that you can slice on, and you can determine and say, hey, is it time for us to drop that old range of gear and stop having to support it because it costs us something to keep supporting an old model that's out there in the field. What I find interesting, I went ahead and threw a trend line on here so you can see that there's this positive correlation as you'd expect. What can be really interesting are things that are extremely far away from that trend line. So in this case, like this here is a decent RF score, low capacity. I wonder if that might be a miscategorized backhaul, actually, Kristian, because that would be unusually low number of subscribers here. Actually, negative capacity. So, but what I find interesting, if we kind of think of that quadrant example again, would be in some cases these access points here, which have beautiful RF scores, there's something that's going wrong in the process here, where they're not either these folks are using a ton of capacity, or maybe there's something else going on that's going to be interesting about these pieces here, where they still have really good RF scores here, but they're underperforming in some other way, right? Similarly, this lower left hand quadrant is going to be, that's everybody understands, that's the one. There's underperformers, they need to be worked on. Of course, there's the shining knights up here at the top who've got, fantastic capacity and fantastic RF scores. Everybody can't be above average. This isn't like Wobegon where all the children are above average. Somebody is going to be below that line. But this is just a really useful exercise when you're looking at two variables and you want to correlate them and say, hey, is there a relationship between these things? Is there a pattern I didn't see before? We talked about like confirming your intuitions. I'll do a lot of exploring of this nature to see, do these two variables correlate in some way? Now, again, correlation isn't causation, but they can give you a point of departure for further exploration. I might say, well, what's different about those? Is there something different about them? In some of the examples I've plotted, this same kind of chart, but colored them by the hardware vendor or by the channel width to see, is there something that we can strongly correlate here? Is there a case where a 40 megahertz channel is actually going to net me less capacity than 220s? Because in most cases that will be true, all else being equal. So I just find that really, really helpful tool to just do what if scenarios and explore, and you'll find some really interesting things out, as Kristian showed in his example as well.
Yeah,
thank you.
Taking all the samples, below the trend line, and saying, like you said, like color, adding in different metrics or variables, so you can then start to spice that and say, yeah, why are these different? How do I pick out the losers and make them better?
Yeah, exactly. Because those are ones because if you just look at one of those dimensions, some of those values are going to be well to the right of the median, and that you wouldn't normally think of it as pathological, and it might not be. But if you compare it with some other metric, that might reveal something quite interesting. So we are going to move on to questions. Sounds like we had a brief technical glitch there, but we're back and we're ready to take your questions. Let's see. I believe you can put them in the use the Q&A tab in your chat. I think Angie is going to help out with that as well, and Kristian is here with me too. So, any questions about this presentation, or any questions about data in general that Kristian and I can tackle? Put them in now. One thing I've found, as I've been working with larger sets of data, it's one of the things I really enjoy about working at Preseem, is that we do have a lot of data. Is that there's ways to explore it that reveal some kind of hidden patterns, things that may not be obvious, that your intuition didn't catch, and it's really It can definitely be tougher when you're starting out and you don't have a lot of data. I mean, I've been asked many times, what gear should I use for X? And you know, until you have some data about how equipment's going to respond, or how your customers are going to do. For example, if you're trying to do customer, you're trying to do backhaul planning, and you don't yet know how much data your customers are going to use. You've got to fall back on industry averages and stuff like that. So it looks like we've got some questions coming in.
Yeah.
So
Did
yeah,
you
go
catch
ahead,
it?
Christian.
I was reading it while you were talking.
Oh,
I think the question was what was the throughput used for your ratio of megahertz to capacity or customers per
so
megahertz?
so what
And
I was using was in Preseem Plus. We have a metric which we call the remaining capacity on the access point, and that's just measured in subscribers. So if you look at how many subscribers you have on a given access point, but it can be hard to quantify how much additional headroom do you have. And so one of the things that we do in Preseem Plus is we measure how much your actual customers. So in your case, Christian, Cal.net's customers, what's the amount of bandwidth that they use? And then we look at the remaining airtime and how efficiently that airtime is being used on a given access point. And we return that number in subscribers. So if you are wanting to know how many more subscribers can I add, or in the case of an overloaded access point, how many should I take away? That is a really helpful. We've gotten a lot of feedback from our customers that that's a really helpful planning tool. And what do you say, Christian? Have you been using that very much?
yeah, and boiling it down to a single metric based on averages, not even just across your own network, but across other ISPs that have the same equipment in similar environments is super helpful.
Perhaps, absolutely. And there's also the aspect that we currently not breaking that down by plan speed. So if you're wanting to know, how many customers could I add at a particular plan speed, we will be doing that. We'll be talking more about that at Wisp America. That's one of the things we've been talking about for about a year now. So then Lou, to finish answering your question, so I just added the number of subscribers that were on the access point, and then I added the number of subscribers that could be added, in additionally, sum those together, and that tells you the total effective capacity of that access point. I then divided that by the channel width, because you don't want to compare two radios running on two, even if it's the same model. They're going to have a different capacity if they're running on a different channel width. It doesn't really matter so much what frequency they're running on, although you'll have differences with like DFS versus upper and lower 5 gigahertz in terms of total efficiency. And then we had a question as well from about the RF scores. Where did that one go? Let's see here. That one seems to have disappeared on me. Let's see here. Having difficulty. Angie, did you see that one?
Hi, yep, Jeremy. That one can just be found under the Publish tab under Q&A.
Oh, awesome. Okay, so the spreadsheet data for the RF score, Stephen, this is one that we can export any table in Preseem, whether it's Plus or not. Any table in Preseem under the equipment, the AP and CPE, and additional types of equipment, and the sites, all the elements that we have in our database. You can export any table using the button at the upper right and export that to CSV. So I was showing a very limited subset of some of the AP based fields. Christian's got a lot of APs, so it made a good data set to use. So that's one way to get that data out. We'd love to have a public API for that. We don't have that out quite yet, but for now, it's it's helpful to do some analysis and some spreadsheet crunching. So hopefully that answers your question. Al's got a question about firmware on the Preseem boxes, not particularly data related, but yeah, just talk to support. Support schedules that and does that. That's something that we do for you regularly. So please just use the chat or send an email to support@preseem.com, and we will help you upgrade the firmware on your boxes. So the question about errors, Al has another question about CRC errors. We do have that under the AP metrics. If you look under the port tab, you will see any errors will be graphed there. We don't currently raise like a diagnostic flag on that, partly because we consider that to be an NMS function. Like that's kind of like a hard down function. Not that we will never do it, but we don't do it today. And I'm sorry, because I'm sure that'd be useful to you, but we can show it in the chart. Thanks, Al. Any other questions? It sounds like we have a few more minutes left.
Reading more into, I think it was Lou's question at the beginning about evaluating the customers per megahertz metric. You mentioned briefly earlier about the nearness to 1 of that ratio. And I think that's been, I have never looked at it before, but I bet that's been very similar over time.
Interestingly, it has, because radios have gotten more efficient, but
customers
are using more bandwidth. So both of those things have gone up simultaneously. Another, we didn't have time to do this in the demo, but slicing that XY chart by model would tell you some interesting things about just overall system efficiency. We publish a lot of this kind of data in our fixed wireless report that you can get off of our website. The most recent one has the most data we've ever put out about what's the real world performance that people are actually getting on their equipment. So one of the things that you can do is you can compare, how's my stuff doing versus everybody else's. And that's actually what the scores do for you. So you don't have to go look at the report every time you want to know something about how your equipment is doing. You can use the RF scores. That's exactly what they do. They tell you how well it's doing. Andrew has a question about link lost on an Ethernet port. Unfortunately, that is not yet in Preseem. That's still kind of an NMSE function, network monitoring or network management system. We do need to put that in, but I don't have any promises on timelines on that. Thanks, Andrew. Any other questions? We still have a good crowd here. It's been really fun. Hopefully you got something out of that. Kristian, while we're waiting for more questions, are there any in your experience, are you doing a lot of API scraping and combining that together into like your own data warehouses for doing analytics?
Yeah, I was debating asking the question if you'd set up a Zabbix sender for for Preseem, or wait, we've used Elasticsearch to aggregate data, pretty much any way we could get it, so we can make those correlations. Because as much data as there is in Preseem, it doesn't have everything,
right?
And so, yes,
and we don't want to have everything in Preseem.
Right.
We want to be hyper focused on what we do well. But at the same time, you can get the latency values out of the API, the older stuff, and we just don't have the new stuff, and we'll get there, because then we realize that if you're going to use it at scale, you're going to combine it in interesting ways. Maybe you want to show it on a map, maybe you want to do something with that in your frequency planning that that we just don't do, or we don't consider part of our core. We feel like you should have access to your data. That's pretty important to us, and we'll need to make sure that you can have that.
Yeah, 45 minutes for a deep dive into Power BI or probably.
It's hilarious how much I find myself using Google Sheets, where Excel is fine, but it's not the same thing. I do analysis in R, the data analytics, data science. It's kind of a data science language, but that's a lot more than most of our customers are going to want to be doing. So Blair asks, any public forums or online resources that have helpful tips on what data to look at, like your graph? I don't know necessarily if there are, specific forums that are useful to me. How about you, Kristian?
That's a really good question. I don't know that I have a good, quick answer. Data normalization, the normal distribution, that kind of stuff that you're talking about is stats.
It's statistic. That's right. Absolutely. It's high school, college level statistics. It's not PhD level. Um, I have actually done things like put on a YouTube channel that has a college course and just learn some of the basic terms about what does what does the data mean. I've found it really helpful um, to look at the to use as a sort of a general guideline when you are looking at something. Always consider it in comparison to something else, because the magnitude might not be the most important thing, or it might be. Like, I'll give you an example. If you are looking at the distribution um, of bandwidth, used by your customers, or total amount of data used by your customers on, over a given month, it's going to have a kind of a classic hockey stick distribution. It's going to be very, you're going to have a lot of customers that don't use a whole lot of data. And then you have the kind of the middle bit, which are use a moderate amount. And then you have this long tail um, of people who, just a few users who use a lot of data. So trying to do capacity planning on like an average of that can be really useless, because it doesn't necessarily tell you what an individual user is going to do. So I'm always looking to say, okay, what can I compare that to? Like, is it going to be um, is it break it down by speed plan? Like, is there going to be a difference there in terms of utilization? I think if you read the fixed wireless report, you see that no, there's not actually a huge difference in that. But um, I'm always looking for ways to compare the real world data against you know something that allows you to remove the differences that are differences of kind. So to use the example, Kristian, of the chart that I was showing, like that chart wasn't showing you what hardware was. The hardware is going to have a distribution itself, right? Depending on how it's deployed in your network. So comparing 2 or 3 dimensions can be really useful. Um, and one of the best ways to do that is with a bubble chart. I didn't get into that because that one's kind of a little bit more complicated to do, where you use the size of the dot as a comparison dimension, and then to make 4 dimensions out of that, you can do color. So that's one of the ones I like to use a lot to see, okay, are these dimensions actually correlated or not? But in terms of public resources, it's that is an entire world, which basically is like, how long is a piece of string? uh, what is it that you're going for? So we are just about out of time here, but I want to thank you all for the excellent questions and the fun discourse. And yes, thanks Angie for hosting us. And we'll see you very shortly for the next session. Thanks, guys. Thanks again, Kristian.
Anytime.